This is episode 23 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Nini Mikhaila, historical costumier, tailor, and author of The Tudor Tailor, Reconstructing 16th Century Dress. Another great method for studying the history of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Lots of little technical terms, but they're such visual images that if you know hawks and the body language as a falconer does, you can actually sort of understand the action or the point that's being made just on the basis of the falconry term. And he's just got this knack of actually describing things in a very sort of visual manner, I think. Shakespeare is one of the few authors that tend to be very accurate, possibly not the most accurate in some cases, but there's certainly evidence that he'd spent time around hawks if he'd not actually participated himself.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
One of the most referenced sports in the plays of William Shakespeare is that of falconry. From hoodwinked to wrapped around your little finger, many of the phrases we use to describe human relationships can be attributed to Shakespeare, but Shakespeare learned them from the sport of falconry. Falconry is the sport that takes large birds of prey and catches food, and it was a popular sport among nobles during Shakespeare's lifetime, but it was also a strategic way to hunt and make sure food was provided for the families that ate what the hawk would catch. Now, falconry is still practiced today, and our guide into the famous Elizabethan sport is the Joint Director of the British Archives of Falconry, David Horobin. David has a lifelong passion for falconry and its cultural heritage. His background in literature and history helped him complete an undergraduate dissertation on the symbolism of falconry in late and medieval English literature. His work was published as Falconry in Literature, and since then he has researched and published numerous titles on Shakespeare, Simon Latham, and contributed to or edited articles on many aspects of falconry and its powerful English national heritage. He joins us today to help us get to know the sport and exactly how the bard knew so much about it when he wrote about the sport in his plays. David, welcome to the show.
Okay, thanks.
Shakespeare's plays contain more than 50 references to falconry, leading many historians to believe Shakespeare himself was an amateur falconer. Was falconry a popular sport for people of Shakespeare's status?
Well, it was certainly popular at the time, but I'm not altogether sure that people from Shakespeare's background were commonly involved. I mean, it was always used as a source of imagery for centuries before Shakespeare, and I think that possibly led to the popularity. But in terms of actual involvement, it was mostly going to be well-to-do people that had got time and access to land to fly hawks. And I guess where lower-class people were involved, there would be sort of professional falconers that actually did the training and maintenance of the hawks.
Several of the terms that Shakespeare used in his plays are actual falconry terms, though.
Oh, yeah, definitely, yeah.
So he knew about this.
He definitely knew, yeah. It's difficult to judge how much contact he got with actual practical falconry. What we find as we go through literature from that era is that there's a lot of people use references. Some of the authors were very obviously involved, and some of our authors obviously hadn't got a clue. It'd probably be like me sort of learning a bit about the NFL and talking to you about it and not having a clue much about what's involved.
Yeah, I couldn't talk football either myself, but with I could talk literature. We could do that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about some of the terms that Shakespeare uses in his plays, because I didn't know they were falconry terms until I researched this. But there's terms like hoodwinked, or as Macbeth puts it, he says scarfing the eye and under your thumb, as well as wrapped around your little finger. And all of these are falconry terms. And I wondered if you could share with us what happens during the sport of falconry that these phrases represent.
I think to do that, we probably need to firstly establish what falconry actually is. So, I mean, technically it's using a trained bird of prey to catch wild quarry. So it is a form of hunting. In order to do that, there's quite an in-depth training process, and the first step is to actually get the hawk accustomed to humans, or what we call manning. And because hawks tend to be quite visual, mostly experience the world through sight, the hood's actually used to calm a newly taken hawk. So if you, in the past, you'd take them from the wild, most modern falconers, certainly in Europe, tend to use captive bred falcons and hawks. What the hood does, it basically reduces visual stress and allows the hawk to hear, all the sorts of background sounds and things that are associated with humans. So they get used gradually to the human world.
And you're talking a hood. This is actually like a small hat or a piece of cloth that goes over their eyes.
Yeah, very light leather cap.
How long does it take to get a bird to accept something like that before I would think they would freak out. Does it not bother them?
It's actually quite a strange thing, because certainly in Shakespeare's day, they'd be sort of physically sort of restrained underwear taken from the wild, what we call casting. So you'd hold them by hand, put the hood on. And back then they used to encourage hawks to eat through the hood first of all. What you find is you start the initial sort of wow moment when you take that hood off, that you tend to do in darkness, by dim light, candlelight. And what that does, it gives the hawk sort of limited access to limited vision of the human. And they tend to be sort of mesmerised by the hood, so they'll actually accept it back on. The hawk are friends just training.
So when Macbeth is talking about scarfing the eye, would they use a piece of leather like they do today, or was it actually a piece of cloth when they were doing this in the Elizabethan era?
Generally speaking, it was a leather hood.
So he uses scarf, but it wouldn't have necessarily been cloth. What about wrapped around your little finger? You talked about manning the bird. That's the person who's holding the hawk, right? Or the arm that the hawk is resting on, yeah?
Yeah, well, the manning's the actual process that, first of all, getting accustomed to mankind. So the hooding's the first step, so they gradually get more and more accustomed to seeing people.
Oh, training them to work with a person. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Of course.
Yeah. Obviously, there's various steps. There's equipment fitted. So we have jesses, which are leather straps, and I think I mentioned in Othello, if I remember rightly. And they're actually used to just hold onto the hawk on the fist, and it just gives you that measure of control so that you can make sure they fly when you want them to fly and not until. And there's a leash attached to that, which is similar to a dog leash. And the jesses are kept under the thumb, which is where that particular saying comes from. So you've got control. And the leash is wrapped securely around the little finger so the hawk can't get caught in it. So I think that's where that one comes from.
Yeah. Well, see, I didn't know that about, like, we assume that wrapped around your little finger is a phrase that means to control someone, but that's because that wrapping it around your finger is how you control the hawk on your fist.
That's right. Yeah. It just ensures that they're secure on the fist until such a time as you come to fly. I mean, there's lots of phrases that come from that. The initial steps then is to persuade the hawk to jump to the fist for food, which is obviously its first initial stage of trust, really. Once they'll come to you for food, then obviously they've overcome that fear.
Unlike many of the elements in Shakespeare's plays, which he uses pretty period-specific events or traditions related to falconry, they reflect things about the Elizabethan era. But the sport itself dates back thousands of years. And I believe in conversations we were having before the episode, you mentioned that this had beginnings in Anglo-Saxon traditions. Is that right? The sport it used to be called fowling, I think, but with this much historical tradition surrounding the sport of falconry, what is it about Shakespeare's plays that lead historians to believe Shakespeare was knowledgeable about the sport, in addition to just being well-read, that he had actually at least seen this sport performed?
I think it's the sheer visual quality. I mean, once you know hawks and the body language, some of the phrases, let's think of a good example, nothing coming to mind. But there's instances where he describes hawks at rest, or I think Henry V rose me in the throne of France. That's a falconry term. Lots of little technical terms, but they're such visual images that if you know hawks and the body language as a falconer does, you can actually sort of understand the action or the point that's being made just on the basis of the falconry term. And he's just got this knack of actually describing things in a very sort of visual manner, I think.
That would suggest he had to have seen it as opposed to just reading about it.
Yeah, and again, different authors. There's Thomas Hayward, for instance, uses falconry terms, and if you analyse that, you can actually there's a passage in Haywood's A Woman Killed with Kindness, which is almost verbatim from a printed book that deals with falconry. So he's actually taken the terms from the book, and as he explains the scene further on, it doesn't really ring true. It's not accurate. Whereas Shakespeare is one of the few authors that tend to be very accurate. Possibly not the most accurate in some cases, but there's certainly evidence that he'd spent time around hawks if he'd not actually participated himself.
Oh, that's very fun. Well, now you sent an article to me that we will link to in today's show notes, but it pointed out that there are actually many kinds of hawks or falcons. Yeah. And I wonder, is there a difference between a hawk and a falcon, as well as what kind of bird was Shakespeare most likely to be referencing?
Right. Okay. Bit in depth, this one. There is
a small question, wasn't it? I'm sorry.
Yeah. There is a very key sort of ornithological difference, but if we go back to Shakespearean times and before, the traditional falconry parlance is a hawk is a hawk. So falcon's still called a hawk. You go hawking with hawks and falcons. And I think this is probably because originally it was a case of, the hawk basically is a trained bird in whatever manner you fly it. It doesn't really matter whether it's a hawk or a falcon, but they do behave in different ways. So the falcons in particular, which tend to be the more popular ones explained or described in Shakespeare, they'd be sort of long pointed wings, dark eyes, capable of very fast, very high flight. And they're flying an entirely different style to a true hawk, such as a goshawk or a sparrowhawk. In falconry terms, the falcons are called long wings for the obvious reason, and the hawks are called short wings.
Now, a goshawk is the one that's in the picture with you on today's episode, right?
That's right, yeah.
Is that the one that you use most often, or the kind that you use?
It depends very much on the country that you live in, and that would have affected what sort of Shakespeare had experience of. I
didn't know if the goshawk was better somehow for certain types of falconry sport over some of the others, or if it's really just
the essential difference is I think the goshawk was probably more popular in early falconry because it can be flown in open or enclosed countryside. I mean, to be brutally honest, it's a killing machine. It's a very potent predator that can take anything up to the size of pheasants, partridge, duck.
It's very good at what it does. Yes.
Very good at hunting. Yeah. So I mean, in the past, when the objective was to get food on the table, and the goshawk, they used to call it the cook's hawk apparently, because it was capable of sort of filling the game larder.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, a bit of an old term.
One place that Shakespeare stands out as unique among Elizabethan references to falconry is with his use of the word haggard. A lot of literary critics of Shakespeare will point this term out. And it's not one that trips up modern readers because it's used so colloquially today that I think most of us forget it has its origins in falconry. But Shakespeare used it in Othello and Much Ado About Nothing, and most famously in Taming of the Shrew to describe a fickle woman who, or here in the States, we have a phrase, and it may just be here in the South. I'm in the Southern United States, but we say flighty.
Yeah.
And to me, that just the fact that comparison itself in describing haggard goes back to falconry. I wanted to ask you, David, please explain to us the story on this idea of haggard and what kind of images Shakespeare was referencing when he applied this term in his plays.
Okay, well, in literary terms, and other authors use it as well, it tends to be seen as quite a negative image. But in actual falconry practice, what a haggard is, it's a mature hawk it's fully mature, fully experienced hunter when it's taken up for training. So a haggard in the past would be a hawk that was sort of trapped as opposed to taken from the nest. Because they were experienced wild hunters, they were very difficult to get used to people in the first place, and they were sometimes difficult to get to fly at a particular quarry. So, for example, if a wild hawk had tried to catch, for example, ducks 4 or 5 times and experienced failure, then switched on to pigeons instead, like any wild predator, they're going to basically take the easiest option. So if you then want that hawk as a falconer to fly at duck, you're going to be struggling, basically. You're going to be sort of going against the hawk's experience. So in some cases, they were difficult to actually train for a particular purpose. On the flip side, they were extremely experienced at flying, quite deadly in the field. And, contemporary falconry authors like Simon Latham have worked on in depth, actually preferred using haggards. So the analogy sometimes, taming of the shrew is quite interesting, because if you analyse the falconry methods that Petruchio is using, certainly by Shakespeare's day, those methods were sort of going out of vogue, and it's almost, to me as a falconer, it's almost suggesting that he's going about, if you like, taming Caterina in quite the wrong way.
He's not playing to her strengths the way you would play a falcon.
No, if you're going to persuade a haggard to work with you, it's kind of and I think this is why it was used for human relationships. It's
a sense of frustration. Yeah, you've got to do it right, or it's not going to work.
Yeah, you've got to basically do it through gentleness, patience, and consistency. If you're going to try and sort of win over a haggard, you've got to have a mutual understanding. You've got to work to their preferences rather than trying to make them conform to yours. So as a falcon, you read Taming of the Shrew and you sort of think, well, he's on a hiding to nothing, because he's never going to get what he wants.
It's fascinating to me what a world of implication and depth to the story understanding falconry really brings to that scene, as opposed to it just being this negative adjective. It's actually a big part of the story.
Yeah, I've seen, understandably feminist critics, Shakespearean critics have sort of, rightly so, said it's an inappropriate way to treat someone. But I think if you look at the hidden subtext, which you're not necessarily going to understand unless you've got that in-depth knowledge of falconry, I think Shakespeare might actually be saying that, look, this guy's not going about it the right way. He's more likely to sort of fail. Let's see.
Well, when I looked up falconry to see how would someone get involved in the sport today, there's an involved process requiring a whole lot of examinations and apprenticeships, even in some cases. But for Shakespeare, this sport seems to be equally as difficult to begin, because it required a number of accoutrements and even like bird-specific housing where you're going to keep the hawks, and was a sport, as you mentioned earlier, primarily for the nobility. So I wonder, is Shakespeare referencing hawking in his plays because it was just that well known, or is he trying to seem noble? We mentioned that he might have attended falconry matches. Now, I don't even know if they're actually called matches, but why was he including this? Was it a reference to his personal experience, or was he appealing to his audience?
I suspect it was more appealing to the audience. You've got sort of a backstory of symbolism that goes back to certainly Chaucer and beyond, and it's not just an English literature thing. You've got parallels in Spanish, French, Italian, German, and hawks are used to basically symbolise the same things as they are in Shakespeare all across Europe at the time. Just as a symbolic sort of element of literature. What you do find at this time is England at the time was going through sort of a bit of a economic revival. You got, if you like, sort of mercantile people coming into the gentry, so people are aspiring to become like gentlemen. And some authors actually ridicule people like that. And there's sort of this evidence that suggests that people actually tried to get involved with falconry, or at least learn the language.
To try and elevate their status?
To sort of elevate themselves. Not necessarily to actually fly a hawk, but just learning. There's things in certain falconry books from the period that suggest the authors know that most of their audiences were buying it just to learn the terms. But, you've got that sort of parallel with, again, like yourself, I have no idea of football, whether American football, English football. But, in modern culture, I suppose you've got a lot of analogies from sports like that, purely because that's what most people are familiar with. So although a lot of people probably didn't necessarily practice falconry at the time.
Now, William Shakespeare loves to reference, in addition to popular culture, he also references legends. And I wonder, are there any falconry lore or famous falconry legends that were popular during this time?
Lots of links to royalty, nobility. There's sort of stories of hawks being used as ransom for knights that were captured in battle. But I think the big thing that is probably significant in Shakespeare is it comes up in lots of secondary sources, lots of academic sources. And there's this concept of species allocation. So you sometimes come across things like a gerfalcon was for a king, merlin was for a lady, a goshawk was for a yeoman. And in falconry terms, it's actually rubbish. There's no truth in that at all. It was just social imagery linked to, perceived characteristics of the person in question. This would suit such a person because it's sort of rare and expensive, or another person because it's sort of small and skittish, okay.
Now, we talked about the sub-story of the use of the term haggard earlier, and I wonder, would the average person attending the Globe understand these references to hawking and falconry as a sport if it's primarily a sport that the nobility was doing? Would the people sitting in the groundlings area understand that part of Shakespeare's play?
I think to a point, yeah. I think, again, you've got that sort of backdrop where people are just sort of familiar with if not the technicalities in depth, they certainly knew the basic process, and you've got that sort of whole sort of cultural significance as well. So I suspect, the average person might not have understood the technicalities. So,
well, what was the reason that, obviously I think participating in the sport was a male-dominated affair, but almost all of the references in Shakespeare's plays are used to describe women. What was it about the specifics of falconry that meant Shakespeare thought these falconry terms were most suitable to describe women and not the characteristics of men?
Where Shakespeare uses falconry terms to talk about women, it tends to be in relation to sort of human relationships. So there's a lot of interesting material where, you've got this stereotypical notion at the time in a patriarchal society that, the man's in control and the woman's subservient. And the popular misconception of falconry is the same. You sort of get this impression that the falconer's in charge and the hawk does what you want, but it's actually almost the opposite way around. It's got to be a mutual relationship. The hawk can do things you can't, you can do things the hawk can't, and
you have to work together. Yeah,
it's an equal partnership. So I think you've got all this analogy of sort of wandering falcons. If you're experienced in falconry, you sort of realise that at best it's a temporary relationship. It's not necessarily one that's going to last forever. Back then, you're liable to lose a hawk quite easily because obviously they were taken from the wild, they'd return to the wild. And I think you have to sort of basically give them full independence. So in literary terms, you get a lot of references to, wandering falcons that disappear and leave the falconer and don't return to the lure, etc.
Yeah. You mentioned that they take them from the wild. Could you tell us more about how that happens? I don't know. I guess I assumed people were breeding falcons for hunting, but it sounds like even today they get these falcons they just capture them and then train them?
It's very much dependent on where you are in the world. Most people in the modern world tend to use domestically bred hawks, but in Shakespeare's day, that there is speculative evidence that people experimented with it, but there are a lot more wild hawks about back then, and it was almost kind of futile. There was also a sort of an argument that, you wanted a wild hawk, there was no sort of merit.
Better instincts, I guess.
Yeah. So it's hard to say how falconry began, but, the likelihood is somebody probably found an injured nestle or, an abandoned nestling rather and reared it. The problem there is you're sort of replacing the hawk's parents and you can't fly, so it's difficult to get that hawk to do.
So now you got to teach things you don't know how to do. Yeah,
it's quite difficult. So with the more experienced hawks of passages and haggards, they would be sort of trapped from the wild. And again, there's a very good chance they're going to be lost over time. So in some ways, there's sort of evidence to suggest that before, in most Western societies, since falconry began to decline in popularity, which was a little after Shakespeare's time, there was a lot more persecution of birds of prey. Obviously, there were sort of competition for people that wanted to shoot game. And, prior to that, in some ways, by actually sort of preserving, maintaining an individual, I think falconry probably increased the chances of the ones that were left in the wild to survive. So they probably kept the populations artificially high.
This sport is fascinating, and I was wondering if you could recommend some places where we can learn more or to even try falconry on our own. Where can a budding falconer look to get involved in this sport today?
It's one of those things that in some ways you can't really try it out without being involved in terms of actual falconry.
That's very encouraging. Thank you, David.
Yeah. You can certainly experience it, but it's a bit like sort of experiencing, being in the army. You've got to sort of sign up to it to do it, sort of thing. Yeah. There are centres in most countries where, you can see trained hawks flying, but that's not necessarily the same as falconry. So the best method is to actually get out with experienced falconers in the field. Most countries, there are associations, clubs. So obviously in the States, you've got the North American Falconers Association. We've got the British Falconers Club in England. There's also an international association. And, that way you can sort of experience what it's all about and I guess decide whether it's for you or not. It's the sort of thing where you've got to really have the time and aptitude for it. And
it's an involved.
That's the best way to, that's the best way to find out.
Yeah. Well, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that is, what is your absolute favorite book of all time? Now, this is 1 to 2 titles that you would take with you on a deserted island, and I've been informed I need to qualify that with, you are allowed a copy of the Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare.
Right. Okay. This is going to sound very heretical, but I think it'd still be some of my falconry books. And it's difficult to choose because I'm sitting here with sort of 400 odd falconry books behind me, and it's which ones would I take? I think Simon Latham's Falconry, which is more or less contemporary with Shakespeare. I think I've got a 1633 edition of that one, and that's sort of a personal favourite. Just because you've got that sort of link to the past, it's almost a living presence as opposed to a book. You've got the feel and the smell of it, and you sort of know that this was someone was looking at this almost 400 years ago.
Almost 400 years ago. Wow, that's exciting. I mean, that's an excellent choice.
That'll be one.
Yeah. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I mean, with the British Archives of Falconry, we've got lots of small projects on at the moment, just sort of researching and writing up about different falconers from history. And I tend to get lots of, requests like your own, just for information on all aspects of the sport. So
I've really enjoyed this conversation. This is a fascinating part of Shakespeare's history, and I really appreciate you sharing your time to help us get to know it better. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
To learn more about falconry in Elizabethan times, as well as about the British Archives of Falconry and David Horobin, please visit today's show notes. You can find all of these links to the history and to these organizations, as well as a freebie created by yours truly, just for you, that demonstrates some of the falconry language that William Shakespeare uses in his plays. You can download all that and more at CassidyCash.com/episode 23. That's CassidyCash.com/EP23. To get up close and personal with some of the history you learned about in today's episode, you can travel with That Shakespeare Girl in September 2019. I have partnered with British History Tours to offer the ultimate Shakespeare experience. It's 8 days in London and Stratford, seeing where William Shakespeare worked, lived, and how he built his enduring legacy. We'll see places like the Globe Theatre, and you'll learn all about staging and performance and his life living in London and Stratford. To get all the details and to sign up to be notified when tickets go on general release later this year, visit CassidyCash.com/travel Shakespeare.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.